Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The conversation over dinner had been playing on repeat in my head all morning. Molly had asked again, about the women I'd been with before we got married. It wasn't the first time she'd brought it up, but the frequency of her curiosity had started to unsettle me. We'd been married for 10 years. Why did it matter now? Why ask about the past when we had built a life together, one that seemed good, solid? I tried to focus on my work as I sat at my desk, sifting through design plans. Mechanical engineering required precision, attention to detail. Today, though, my mind was elsewhere. I could still hear her voice, the way she'd casually slipped in those questions, almost as if she was trying to act like it was no big deal. How many women were there before me, she'd asked, her tone light, almost playful. I had answered honestly. A few, but nothing serious. She smiled at me, but there was something else behind it. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then she asked the question that bothered me the most. Do you ever think about them? No, I had said, firm and decisive, trying to squash whatever doubts she had in her mind. Why would I? We've been married for a decade, Molly. You're all I think about. That seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment, but the conversation left me uneasy. As I drove to work the next morning, I couldn't help but replay it. Why was she suddenly so fixated on my past? I never asked her those kinds of questions. We were married, happy, weren't we? Molly and I had what most people would consider an ideal life. A beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood, successful careers, and a relationship that had survived the trials of time. We weren't without our problems, but who is? We were partners, best friends, lovers. At least, that's how I saw it. She had been taking more business trips lately, and although it was nothing unusual, something felt off. Molly worked as a chartered accountant for a national firm, and she'd been traveling frequently with a colleague named Nick. At first, she would come home and talk about how well they got along, how Nick was great at his job. But after the first few trips, her stories about him became fewer and fewer until she stopped mentioning him altogether. It didn't bother me at first. People get busy, work gets hectic. But her behavior had started to change in small ways. She seemed distracted, distant. Our conversations felt shorter, our intimacy more routine. I brushed it off as stress from her job, from the travel. Yet, there were moments when I'd catch her staring out the window with a look that seemed far away. It wasn't until a Friday morning when she casually told me she'd be gone for the weekend on another business trip that the unease turned into a full-blown suspicion. I'm heading out of town for a few days, she said over breakfast. She didn't look up from her phone as she said it, her tone matter-of-fact. Another trip? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She nodded, still scrolling through emails or messages. Yeah, Nick and I have to meet with a client in the city. Should be back by Sunday evening. The words were like a punch in the gut, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't unusual for her to travel with colleagues, but something about the way she said it, the casualness, the lack of detail, raised red flags. I see, I said slowly, watching her closely. So, what's this client about? Molly finally looked up, blinking at me like she was surprised I'd asked. Just some firm we've been working with. It's no big deal, Billy. No big deal. But it felt like a big deal. I didn't press further. Instead, I smiled and nodded, playing along. All right, then. Just make sure you get some rest between all that work. Of course, she said, giving me a quick peck on the cheek before grabbing her bag. Love you. See you Sunday. And with that, she was gone. I stared after her, my unease growing. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the workday ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to Molly and that trip. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. I spent most of the day wrestling with my thoughts. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe it was just stress. But that feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. That night, as I sat alone on the couch, I found myself staring at the empty space where Molly usually sat, her absence more noticeable than ever. By Saturday morning, my suspicion had become too strong to ignore. I couldn't help myself. I needed to know. Something was wrong, I could feel it. And so, I did what I'd always promised myself I wouldn't do. I went through her things. Molly wasn't careless. She never left her phone lying around, and I didn't know her password. But there were other ways to find answers. While she was gone, I searched through her suitcase, her closet. At first, it felt wrong, like I was invading her privacy. But then I found it. Tucked away in the pocket of an old bag was a receipt from a hotel. It was dated from a few months ago, during one of her work trips. I checked the hotel, it wasn't one her company used. I checked the date, it didn't match up with the trip she'd told me about. My hands shook as I held the receipt. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. She had lied to me. All the little changes in her behavior, the sudden interest in my past, the distance between us, it all made sense now. She wasn't just distracted, she was hiding something. Or rather, someone. I put the receipt back where I found it, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? Was it Nick? It had to be. My thoughts spiraled as I sat down on the edge of the bed. Molly had been spending her weekends with someone else, under the guise of work, while I stayed home, blissfully unaware. I thought about confronting her, about calling her right then and there, but something stopped me. I wasn't ready to blow it all up. Not yet. I needed more than a hotel receipt. I needed to know the full extent of what had happened. The next day, I found myself digging deeper. I went through her phone bill, her credit card statements. Sure enough, there were charges from places she hadn't mentioned, dinners for two, hotel stays that didn't line up with her supposed business trips. The evidence was all there, staring me in the face. Molly was cheating on me. The realization hit me like a freight train. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, had betrayed me. The worst part was that she hadn't even bothered to hide it well. She must have thought I was too trusting, too naive to notice. And for a while, I had been. But now, everything was different. I spent the rest of the weekend in a daze, trying to wrap my head around what I'd found. I didn't know what to do, how to confront her, how to even begin to unravel the mess that had become my marriage. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. By Sunday evening, when Molly returned home, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to blow up, scream, or yell. I wasn't going to confront her in a rage. No, that would be too easy. I had something else in mind, something that would hurt her more than any words ever could. She walked through the door with a bright smile, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just spent the weekend with another man. "Hey, Billy," she said cheerfully, dropping her bag by the door. "Hey, Molly," I replied, forcing a smile. "How was the trip?" "It was fine," she said, moving into the kitchen. "Just a lot of meetings, but we got a lot done." I followed her, my heart pounding in my chest. "That's good. Glad to have you home." She glanced at me over her shoulder, that same smile still plastered on her face. She had no idea that I knew. But soon, she would. Molly's deception hung over me like a storm cloud, threatening to break at any moment. But I wasn't going to rush into it. That Sunday night, as she unpacked and settled back into our routine, I kept up the facade. I smiled, laughed at her jokes, and even kissed her goodnight, all the while knowing that the foundation of our marriage had cracked beyond repair. I lay awake in bed after she'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. My mind was racing, plotting. She had no idea that I knew, no clue that her carefully constructed lies were about to come crashing down around her. But I wasn't going to confront her until I was ready. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. No, I wanted something more. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. And when the moment came, I wanted it to hit her like a ton of bricks. The next morning, I acted like it was any other Monday. I got up early, kissed Molly on the cheek, and headed to work. But my mind was already moving 2 steps ahead. I started planning. At the office, I couldn't focus on my tasks. The details of the engineering designs in front of me blurred as I kept replaying the evidence I had found. The hotel receipt, the phone bills, the credit card charges, it was all there, clear as day. She hadn't even tried to hide it well. Maybe she thought I'd never notice, that I was too trusting or too busy with my work. But now that I knew, the signs were everywhere. I had always prided myself on being calm, level-headed. In my line of work, precision and control were everything. And I was going to apply that same level of control to what came next. This wasn't going to be some messy confrontation. This was going to be methodical, planned, and devastating. By the end of the day, I had formulated a plan. The anniversary of our wedding was coming up in 2 weeks, and it was going to be the perfect stage for my revelation. I wasn't just going to expose her affair, I was going to take back control of my life in a way that she wouldn't see coming. In the days that followed, I prepared myself. I gathered every bit of evidence I had on Molly and Nick. I combed through her phone records, traced the dates of her so-called business trips, and matched them with the hotel stays. I even reached out to one of her colleagues at the firm, casually asking about their travel schedule. It didn't take much to confirm what I already knew. Nick had been her travel companion more often than anyone else. The pieces fell into place, one by one. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I kept playing the role of the loving husband. I even planned a weekend getaway for us, under the guise of celebrating our anniversary. It wasn't hard to sell her on the idea. Molly, after all, loved the idea of luxurious trips, and I had chosen the very place where we had spent our honeymoon. It was a 5-star resort nestled in the mountains, the kind of place where everything felt perfect, where we had once been so deeply in love. She seemed excited, even flattered. "You really want to go back there?" she asked, her eyes lighting up when I showed her the booking confirmation. "It's been so long." "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "I thought it would be nice to relive the good times." Molly beamed at me, and for a moment, I almost believed that she was still the woman I had married. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold reality of what I knew. The weekend of the trip arrived, and we packed up the car like any other vacation. Molly was in good spirits, humming along to the music as we drove out of the city and toward the mountains. I played along, asking her about work, about how things were going at the firm. She kept it light, talking about office politics and her busy schedule, never once mentioning Nick. It was almost impressive how easily she lied, how effortlessly she concealed her affair. Almost. The resort was just as beautiful as I remembered it. The sprawling landscape, the crisp mountain air, the luxurious cabins, it was the perfect setting. We checked into our suite, and I could see the nostalgia wash over Molly as she walked through the room. It was the same suite we'd stayed in on our honeymoon, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she felt any guilt. But if she did, she didn't show it. The first night passed uneventfully. We had dinner on the terrace, looking out at the mountains as the sun set behind them. Molly talked about her family, about how she wanted to spend more time with her parents, maybe take a trip to visit them later in the year. I listened, nodding, keeping the conversation light. But inside, I was waiting for the right moment. That moment came the next evening. After a day spent hiking and exploring the resort, we returned to our suite to get ready for dinner. Molly was in the bathroom, freshening up, while I poured 2 glasses of wine. I stood by the window, looking out at the darkening sky, my mind racing with everything I was about to say. When she finally came out, dressed in a sleek black dress, her hair falling in soft waves. She looked beautiful. It almost hurt to see her like that, knowing what I knew. "Ready?" she asked, smiling as she reached for her glass of wine. "Actually," I said, my voice steady, "there's something we need to talk about first." Molly froze, the glass halfway to her lips. "What is it?" I turned to face her, setting my own glass down on the table. "I know about Nick," I said, the words falling like stones between us. Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, keeping my voice calm. "The hotel stays, the phone calls, the texts. I know everything, Molly." She set the glass down slowly, her hands trembling. "Billy, Don't bother lying," I cut her off. "It's too late for that. I have all the proof I need." Molly's eyes welled with tears, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then explain it to me," I said, crossing my arms. "Explain the hotel receipts, the dinners, the weekends you spent with him while you told me you were working." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The silence between us was deafening. I took a step toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. "You've been lying to me for months, Molly. I trusted you, and you betrayed me." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she shook her head. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just what?" I snapped. "It just happened. You just accidentally ended up in a hotel room with another man." She flinched at the harshness of my words, but I didn't care. I was done playing the role of the understanding husband. "I've been planning this for weeks," I continued, my voice cold. "I booked this trip so that you'd feel safe, comfortable. So that you wouldn't see it coming." Molly's eyes widened in shock. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's over," I said, my voice steady. "When we get home, I'll be filing for divorce. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The papers will be ready by Monday." Her breath hitched as the full weight of my words sank in. "Billy, please," she begged, reaching out for me. "We can work through this. I'll do anything. I still love you." I stepped back, out of her reach. "You should have thought about that before you decided Nick was worth more than your marriage." For the first time, Molly was speechless. She looked at me, her face a mixture of shock and regret, but there was nothing she could say to fix what she had done. "I loved you, Molly," I said quietly, my voice breaking slightly. "But I can't forgive this. You threw it all away." And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the ruins of our marriage. The drive home was eerily quiet. Molly sat beside me, staring out the window, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She had barely said a word since the night before when I had confronted her. It was as though the life had been drained out of her, leaving nothing but a hollow shell of the woman I once loved. I wasn't sure what I had expected. Maybe some kind of catharsis, some sense of closure or victory after finally exposing her lies. But all I felt was an empty, gnawing pit in my stomach. The moment I'd imagined, her shock, her tears, her regret, had come and gone, and I was left with the same question: what now? The reality of divorce hung heavy in the air between us, unspoken but ever present. I'd made my decision, and I wasn't going to back down. But it wasn't easy to walk away from 10 years of marriage, even knowing what she had done. There were still pieces of us tangled together, memories that clung to the edges of my mind. Moments of laughter, of love, of shared dreams. But those memories were tainted now, poisoned by her betrayal. As we pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of our house didn't bring the comfort it usually did. The home we had built together, the place where we had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and quiet nights on the couch, felt like a stranger's house. I couldn't picture us living here anymore, not after everything that had happened. Molly got out of the car slowly, hesitating for a moment before following me inside. It was late afternoon, and the house was filled with the soft light of early evening, casting long shadows across the walls. She set her bag down by the door and stood there, as if unsure of what to do next. "I'm going to stay with my parents for a few days," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond right away. Part of me had been expecting this, but hearing it still stung. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the floor. "That's probably for the best." She hesitated, glancing at me like she wanted to say something more, but no words came. Instead, she walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the entryway. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards as she moved around the bedroom, packing her things. I couldn't help but think about the first time we had moved into this house. We had been so excited, so full of plans for the future. We'd painted the walls together, picked out furniture, even planted a garden in the backyard. It had been a fresh start, a new chapter in our lives. But now, it felt like those memories belonged to another couple, not the two people we had become. Molly came back downstairs with a small suitcase, her face pale and drawn. She stood in front of me, awkwardly shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I'll, come back for the rest of my things later." "Take your time," I said, my voice flat. There was a long, uncomfortable silence between us. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the shame, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase what she'd done, to make me forget the lies, the betrayal. She had broken something between us that couldn't be fixed. "I'm sorry, Billy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never wanted it to end like this." I looked at her, at the woman I had once thought I would spend the rest of my life with, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just emptiness. "It didn't have to end like this," I said quietly. "You made that choice." Her shoulders sagged, and she wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. Without another word, she turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing alone in the house we had built together. I watched through the window as she got into her car and drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I had won, hadn't I? I had gotten my revenge. I had exposed her, torn down her lies, and taken back control of my life. But as the emptiness settled deeper into my chest, I realized that revenge wasn't what I had thought it would be. It hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't made the pain go away. All it had done was leave me standing here, alone, in the ruins of what used to be my life. That night, I tried to go about my usual routine. I heated up a frozen dinner, sat down in front of the TV, and flipped through the channels. But nothing could hold my attention. Everything felt wrong. The silence of the house was suffocating, and every room I walked into was filled with memories of Molly. I wandered through the house, aimless, as if searching for something that wasn't there anymore. The photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, even the throw pillows on the couch, they were all reminders of the life we had shared, the life that was now shattered beyond repair. I found myself in the bedroom, standing at the foot of the bed we had once shared. The covers were still rumpled from the night before, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands clenched into fists, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to break through. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were supposed to grow old together, to build a family, to face the challenges of life side by side. But now, all of that was gone, ripped away by her betrayal. And no matter how much I tried to tell myself that I had done the right thing by ending it, by standing up for myself, it didn't change the fact that I felt like I had lost everything. The next few days passed in a blur. I went to work, trying to focus on the tasks in front of me, but my mind kept drifting back to Molly, to the life we had lost. I hadn't heard from her since she left, and part of me was grateful for the silence. But another part of me, the part that still clung to the memories of the woman I had loved, wondered what she was thinking, what she was feeling. I knew I had to move on. I knew I had to let go of the past and start building a new life for myself. But the weight of everything that had happened felt like an anchor, pulling me down into the depths of grief and regret. One evening, as I sat on the couch staring blankly at the TV, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Molly. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. "Can we talk?" I stared at the words for a long time, my mind racing. What was there left to talk about? We had said everything that needed to be said. I had made my decision. There was no going back. But something in me couldn't ignore it. I hesitated for a moment before typing a short reply. "When?" A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "Tomorrow. Can I come by after work?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Part of me wanted to say no, to shut the door on whatever was left between us. But another part of me, the part that still needed closure, reluctantly agreed. Okay. The next day felt like a ticking clock, each hour bringing me closer to the inevitable confrontation. I wasn't sure what Molly wanted to talk about, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. When I got home from work, I paced around the living room, waiting for her to arrive. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Molly standing there, looking smaller than I remembered. She stepped inside, her eyes downcast, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was thick, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and desperation. "Billy," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you more than I can ever fix. But please, just let me explain." The air between us felt suffocating as Molly stood in the entryway, her hands wringing nervously at her sides. I could see the strain in her face, the way her eyes darted around the room as if searching for something to anchor her. But there was nothing left for her here. Not anymore. She had asked to talk, but what was there left to say? We both knew how this was going to end. I had already made my decision, divorce, final and clear. Yet, the way she looked at me, as if there was still some sliver of hope, made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Can we sit down?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She moved slowly, hesitantly, as though each step weighed heavier than the last. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between us feeling like a chasm that had grown wider with every lie, every secret. She fidgeted with her hands in her lap, staring down at them as if the words she wanted to say were written there. "I don't know where to start," she said after a long pause. "Just say it," I replied, my voice colder than I intended. I didn't have the energy for drawn-out explanations or apologies. I just wanted this to be over. She nodded, swallowing hard before she began. "Billy, I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make right. What I did, it's unforgivable. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I never meant for it to get this far." I stared at her, not saying a word. Her guilt was palpable, but it didn't move me. The damage was done. There was no going back. "It started out as, just flirting," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. He was there during a time when I felt like we were growing apart. I know it sounds like an excuse, but I felt so distant from you. You were so busy with work, with everything else, and I didn't know how to reach you anymore." My jaw clenched. It was the same old story, blaming the cracks in our marriage for her affair. I had heard it before, and it didn't make it hurt any less. She took a deep breath and continued, her eyes still fixed on her hands. "I didn't think it would go beyond that. But it did. And once it started, I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to tell you." I let her words hang in the air, unmoved by the tears that had started to pool in her eyes. "So you kept lying," I said quietly. "You kept sneaking around, pretending everything was fine while you were with him." Molly flinched at the harshness in my tone, her hands trembling as she wiped at her eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Billy," she whispered. "I'm asking for a chance to explain why I did what I did." "Explain?" I said, my voice rising with a bitterness I couldn't hold back. "You think explaining it will make it any better? You think telling me you were lonely justifies what you did?" She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "No, I don't. I know nothing can make this right. But I can't stand the thought of you hating me forever." I stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. The frustration, the hurt, the betrayal, it all bubbled up inside me, threatening to boil over. "You don't want me to hate you, Molly? After everything you've done, after all the lies? What do you expect me to feel?" Molly's sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity for her, but it was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had consumed me for months. "I'm sorry," she choked out between sobs. "I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. I turned to face her, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had to say. "It's over, Molly. I'm done." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with panic. "No, please, Billy. I can't do this anymore," I cut her off, shaking my head. "I've tried to make sense of it, tried to understand how we got here, but the truth is, I don't care anymore. I don't care why you did it. I don't care about your excuses. I'm done." Molly's breath hitched, and she stood up, rushing toward me. "Please, Billy, don't say that. Don't leave me like this. We can fix this. I'll do anything. There's nothing left to fix." I shouted, my voice echoing through the house. The words hung in the air like a final verdict, and I saw her crumble in front of me. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, begging me to give her another chance. But I couldn't. I had nothing left to give her. The doorbell rang, cutting through the tense silence between us. I frowned, glancing toward the door. Who the hell could it be at a time like this? "I'll get it," I muttered, walking over to the door. Molly stayed on the floor, her sobs quieting to soft, broken whimpers. When I opened the door, a man stood there, dressed in a uniform. A paramedic. My heart skipped a beat, confusion flooding my mind. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "Are you William Harrison?" the paramedic asked, his expression somber. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, my heart pounding now. "I'm afraid there's been an accident," he said slowly, his voice heavy with regret. "Your wife, Molly, she was in a car accident a few miles from here. She didn't make it." For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him right. The world around me seemed to tilt, the words not sinking in. "What are you talking about?" I stammered, my brain struggling to catch up. She's right here." The paramedic frowned, glancing past me into the house. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we found her at the scene about an hour ago. She was driving alone. It was a fatal collision." I shook my head, trying to piece it together, but the pieces didn't fit. "No, she's here," I said, my voice faltering. I turned around, looking back into the house. The living room was empty. Molly wasn't there. I stepped back, confusion giving way to a cold, creeping realization. She hadn't been there at all. I had been talking to no one. The sobs, the pleas, the apologies, they had all been in my head. The paramedic was still talking, but I couldn't hear him anymore. The world around me blurred as the weight of it all crashed down on me. Molly had died in that car accident, and I had been imagining her presence, desperate, broken, clinging to the idea that she could somehow make it right. But she was gone. She had been gone for hours. And the worst part? I never had the chance to say goodbye. I collapsed to my knees in the doorway, the grief overwhelming me, crushing me. The anger, the betrayal, the bitterness, it all faded away, replaced by a hollow, aching void. Molly was gone. And I was left with nothing but the echoes of the life we had shared, the ghost of a love that had died long before she did. And in the end, I was more alone than I had ever been.